Hello and welcome. My name is Payam Niaid. I'm a professor of medicine in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care at UCSF. I'm also director of the UCSF Center for Tuberculosis.
Yes, and good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Chen, also at UCSF, a professor of medicine here, and the director of the Curry International TB Center. And we just want to welcome all of you. We know you've been busy, and it's time to talk some TB. So good morning and welcome.
So I'm going to welcome everyone with a, just to set the stage a little bit on why we're all gathered to raise awareness around TB today. We have a terrific lineup of speakers and guests that we're excited to have joined us today. On the one-year anniversary of the World Health Organization designating COVID-19 global pandemic, upending life as we know it, the New York Times opinion piece by the columnist Tom Friedman that caught my eye. He titled it, "1 year later, we still have no plan to prevent the next pandemic. And yes, there could soon be another pandemic." In his cautionary opinion piece, he discussed future risks as it pertained to infectious disease, to mankind, to global economies, to life as we know it. Sadly, I believe, whereas the article was excellent, he overlooked one glaring reality, and that is that the next pandemic is here and has been so for millennia. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is the leading cause of death worldwide from a single infectious agent, now ranking above HIV/AIDS and surpassed only by COVID-19 for this year. COVID-19 has become the world's most lethal infection in a span of a year. But with the advent of unprecedented development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and numerous effective and safe vaccines, the disease we hope will soon be abated, leaving TB to sadly take the #1 spot for cause of death again. Indeed, tuberculosis causes nearly 4,000 deaths daily. Its treatments are frankly unsatisfactory. They take 6 to up to 30 months to treat for patients who have this infection and disease. 6 out of 10 cases of drug-resistant TB around the world go untreated. And the cost of MDR TB alone, let alone drug-susceptible TB, are estimated to reach 16 trillion by 2050. And sadly, we must not forget that over 1 million children a year get sick from TB as well. So what is holding us back? I will argue that the bottlenecks to ending TB are fundamentally political and financial. And we have as a TB community for many years, but what's really proven the case is what's been shown to be possible with the fast-tracked R&D and collaborative research that has been mobilized for COVID-19, with over $160 invested through 744 program announcements, now well over 50,000 papers published within a year, coupled with an incredibly ambitious strategic plan for COVID-19 research that was released by the NIH. We have achieved a lot through humankind's ingenuity, partnership, and collaboration. And the consequences of that are shown in this vaccine tracker, which just shows the unprecedented development, getting to numerous vaccines being approved through the chain of vaccine development. I wish I could say that we were anywhere near this for TB. So I think we're here today to also recognize that what can be done for COVID-19 should be done for TB. And US global leadership for TB is critical. US funding for investments for TB should focus on increasing TB R&D to $445 million across all US research institutions, including the CDC, which does TB R&D. I think this is unbeknownst to many. In addition, We should seek to meet funding goal of 225 million for the CDC Division of TB Elimination, which oversees one of the clinical trial networks you'll hear about today, the TB Trials Consortium. Without this increase, current funding is at about the same level as it was in 1994. 21 million for global efforts at the CDC's Division of Global HIV and TB, and increased PEPFAR funding are essential for TB HIV. I argue that there's a win-win on TB and COVID, and we should accelerate the investments in health programs, our public health infrastructure, that include a 1.56 billion investment for bilateral USAID TB programs, in addition to the 3.5 billion invested for COVID response. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, "Dare mighty things." This quote is on the Jet Propulsion Lab walls, I understood, was on the parachute of the Mars Perseverance rover, shown here. You can see the letters in binary code has been annotated here. This is from a speech of Teddy Roosevelt to dare us to try to be the best that we can be, to envelope and seek triumphs. And I hope that that inspires you for the rest of today's events. Next, I'd like to welcome and thank Chancellor Hallgood, UCSF Chancellor Hallgood, who has been an integral member of our UCSF community since 1982, when he came to work with Doctors John Clements and William Tooley, pioneers in the discovery and therapeutic uses of pulmonary surfactant in premature babies. Dr. himself had come to UCSF upon invitation from Dr. Bro, who is director of the CVRI, Cardiovascular Research Institute at UCSF. So Chancellor Hallgood is a key member of renowned lineage of researchers in cardiopulmonary disease, and we're fortunate to have him serve as Chancellor of UCSF today, and Arthur and Tony Remby-Rock Distinguished Professor, and we're delighted he has agreed to provide remarks for this 2021 World TB Day. Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Payam, and welcome to everyone around the world to this remarkable symposium on TB, and to celebrate and acknowledge the devastation that this disease has caused for a millennium, as Payam said. Now, over the last year, the world's attention has rightly been turned to combating the devastating ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has now claimed more than 2.6 million lives worldwide. As has been said, impressive biomedical research advances with aggressive timelines have finally delivered new diagnostics, new therapies, and highly effective vaccines that finally give us all so much hope for the future. But today we are gathered to acknowledge another global pandemic, and that is tuberculosis. TB and COVID-19 are both infectious diseases that attack the lungs. Both diseases have similar symptoms, such as cough, fever, and difficulty breathing. TB causes disease in nearly 10 million people worldwide every year, and killing more than 1.6 million people annually. So on the heels of impressive advances in COVID-19, we are right to wonder what can be done to address this other infectious disease that, unlike the novel coronavirus, has plagued humankind for a millennia. In the absence of a vaccine, and as drug resistance grows, the TB therapeutics field is pursuing new, safer, better tolerated, less toxic, and more effective treatment regimens for the millions of people impacted by this disease globally. So there is great hope on the horizon. One CDC-funded trial, co-designed and stewarded by faculty here at UCSF, recently reported a first in 40-year achievement of successfully shortening the duration of TB treatment to 4 months for drug-sensitive TB. The results of this landmark trial will be reviewed soon by the World Health Organization in consideration of revising global treatment guidelines. High-level results from this study will be presented later this morning by Dr. Payam Niaid, protocol co-chair of the trial and director of our UCSF Center for Tuberculosis. So while we have seen promising advances through the federal government's commitment to combating TB, the reality of years of flat funding for the Division of Tuberculosis Elimination at the CDC has unfortunately slowed progress towards the goal of eliminating TB in the United States. We hope that the unprecedented success of COVID-19 vaccine development, made possible by scientific collaboration, really unprecedented international scientific collaboration, and supported by federal investment, inspires Congress to redouble their efforts to address the TB pandemic as well. Now, this morning, we are honored to welcome two congressional champions of biomedical research, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, Chair of the Appropriations Committee, and Congressman Ami Bera, Co-Chair of the Congressional TB Caucus. They will share with us their perspective on federal TB policy and priorities. We are also honored today to have the participation by Dr. Swaminathan as Chief Scientist at the WHO and Dr. Tony Fauci as Director of NIAID. Their commitments to biomedical research in TB that will advance promising new diagnostics, new regimens, and new TB vaccines are deeply appreciated. So I personally wish you all a very successful World TB Day event. And again, I express my appreciation to Congresswoman DeLauro, Congressman Bera, Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Swaminathan for sharing their remarks on TB in a new COVID-19 world. So I know that Congresswoman DeLauro was called out for just a minute, but I believe she is back. So I will go ahead and introduce her. And if by chance she is not able to join us, I'll hand it over to PM to introduce Congressman Bera. So it's my honor now to introduce our first speaker, Chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Congressman Rosa DeLauro. Congressman DeLauro, I speak on behalf of UCSF students, faculty, and clinicians when I thank you for your steadfast support for reliable, sustainable, and robust federal investments in biomedical research. We know that the significant funding increases to NIH research over each of the last 5 years are due in large part to your clear-eyed leadership as ranking member and now chair of the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee. This increased federal commitment has paved the way for discoveries that made the lightning-quick scientific response to COVID-19 possible. We look forward to hearing your perspective on federal investment in the ongoing pan-global battle against TB, which continues to have a devastating toll on the world, and how this community can best advocate for funding and policies to support our collective efforts to alleviate the suffering and death associated with this disease. So thank you, Congresswoman DeLauro, for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Chancellor. How good it is to see you again. I recall my trip to San Francisco with Dr. Lieberman and others and so forth. It's a pleasure to see you again. And thank you so much for the warm introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm so pleased to join the University of California, San Francisco Center for Tuberculosis on the World TB Day webinar. We have so many extraordinary researchers and students, health professionals that are here with us today. So I look forward to discussing the greatest challenges and opportunities that are ahead of us so that you can reach our targets, TB targets 2022. A special thank you to Eric Goosby, a professor at UCSF, for moderating, and a remarkable panel that is lined up here and eager to hear your insights. I also want to thank, and it's a pleasure to be with my colleague, Congressman Ami Berry, who has a distinguished background as a physician and representative, and his remarks I know will be especially timely. And the World Health Organization and the chief scientists and put a lot of faith in science, and it's wonderful to return to that sense of science helps lead the way for us. Sumia, and I don't know if I can pronounce your last name, but Sumia, I'm delighted to be with you. And you have left an indelible mark of progress within the scientific movement. And I have to personally say a thank you to Dr. Anthony Fauci. And to say to you personally, Dr. Fauci, that you maintain the integrity of science under the fierce assault against science, and you protected the institutions under the NIH that had to maintain the confidence of the public. And so I thank you for your courage, and we cannot put into words how grateful we are for you and all that you have done. You led the nation through one of our darkest hours, and we continue to try to move forward. And I know it's with your leadership, we are going to continue our way to brighter days. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, tuberculosis was the #1 infectious disease killer globally, causing 1.4 million deaths and lifelong health complications for millions more. But thanks to the many people here today, the United States is a global leader in research and development for better tools to prevent, diagnose, and treat tuberculosis. Let me take a second to speak personally. I was born in 1943, and at that time, my dad was in a tuberculosis sanitarium in Connecticut, in Wallingford, Connecticut, and his mother died in Italy from tuberculosis, and so I can tell you that I spent the early years of my life getting tuberculin tests very, very often. And I can remember in those early days when I was growing up, my dad was always, wouldn't let me drink from his cup or eat from his dish or you know, and use any of the utensils. And he was in the sanitarium for a year. And in those days, it was treated with being outdoors and being in cold weather. So I have a personal interest in this effort as well. And the leadership here is in thanks part, the US's leadership is in part to the ambitious research of the TB Trials Consortium, which is housed within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Division of TB Elimination. The TBTC conducts clinical research of high public health relevance. It's key to strengthening domestic and global campaigns to eliminate TB. And since its founding in 1993, the clinical trials have enrolled over 18,000 participants across the United States and around the world. And an honor to chair the Labor, Health, and Human Services Committee of Appropriations, which has the ability to directly fund these life-saving institutions. And we championed the $10 million increase in CDC's Division of TB Elimination after years of flat funding, directed the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority to report on investments in new TB diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines to address the growing threat of drug-resistant TB. However, COVID-19 has only made that struggle against TB more difficult as researchers, clinicians, public health programs, and resources shifted to focus on the pandemic. The reduced rates of TB case reporting indicate that TB patients have been unable or reluctant to seek care for their disease for the past year. But this decrease does not necessitate a decline in the cases, only in sought care. To add fuel to the fire, the TB research and development pipeline has also been adversely impacted by the increased costs and restrictions of conducting clinical trials with precautionary measures. Yet through all of these challenges, you continue to make incredible progress, including delivering a new short course regimen to treat TB in 4 months. This is the first successful treatment shortening drug-susceptible TB treatment in over 40 years, and I offer my congratulations on a remarkable achievement. And as we begin to emerge from the coronavirus pandemic, one lesson learned is that the value of scientific collaboration across federal agencies, academic medicine, and industry. For example, the crucial role that the CDC and programs like the Division of Tuberculosis Elimination play in not only in the oversight of our public health, but also in the conduct of those clinical trials, such as the new 4-month regimen for TB, that bring new, invaluable tools for us to combat global pandemics. As chair now of the Appropriations Committee, I am so looking forward to working with the administration, with the NIH, the CDC, with BARDA, USAID, and the World Health Organization and others, support USCS's efforts to end the scourge of tuberculosis. It is so important to me personally. We have seen the risk of chronically underfunding pandemic preparedness and response, and we cannot let that happen with tuberculosis. So I thank you for your work, for your intellectual pursuits of these efforts, your passion, your commitment to making a difference for life-saving protocols. Here is to the USCS for another year of discovery, of breakthrough, and of innovation to continue to save lives. And I thank you for asking me to join this afternoon with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative DeLaura. You are a true champion of science, and I can speak for the entire global scientific community in expressing our appreciation for your leadership, your advocacy, your passion. And thank you for sharing your personal story around TB. So those kind of stories that put a human face on the work that we are all doing. So thank you so much for your championing of science and all you do for us in Washington at this critical time. Now I'll turn the program back over to Payam to continue with the symposium. Thank you again, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you. Look
Thank
forward
you,
to seeing you again.
Yeah, welcome back to San Francisco in the near future.
Wonderful comments. Thank you, Congresswoman DeLaura. You've humbled us with your comments. Thank you. And Chancellor Hogan. It's my pleasure now to welcome my co-moderator for this first session, Dr. Eric Goosby. Dr. Goosby is Distinguished Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Global Health Delivery, Diplomacy, and Economics at the Institute for Global Health Sciences at UCSF. He runs COVID-19 Advisory Board and served as the UN Special Envoy for Tuberculosis from 2015 to 2019. He was President Obama's ambassador at large and implemented the US President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. Thank you, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you, Payam. That's a very kind introduction, one that my father would have smiled at and my mother might believe. So thank you so much. I wanted to really take time to introduce Representative Ami Bera. He's a physician himself, trained in San Francisco. He's been a member of the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013 and is the longest serving Indian American in Congress. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation. He's also a senior member of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. As a medical doctor and former public health official, Congressman Bera is a strong supporter of American leadership in global health. He is a member of the CSIS Commission on Strengthening American Health Security, which made a series of recommendations in 2019 and has held 2 congressional hearings on the coronavirus outbreak itself. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the co-chair of the Tuberculosis Elimination Caucus in the House of Representatives. It's a pleasure to have you here to speak to us today, Congressman.
Let's see. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. And if you
And it doesn't look like I can start my video.
Oh, okay. We can hear you fine,
But,
Congressman.
okay, I will go. It seems like the host probably has to turn my video on, but I will go ahead and chat right now. And let's see. There we go.
There you go.
Great.
There you go.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm going to start by framing some of the comments within the pandemic that we're currently in with COVID-19. And if we needed any reminder as to why we have to double our efforts to eliminate tuberculosis, the current pandemic reminds us of two things: how interconnected our world is today in terms of what happens abroad affects us here domestically, and within the realm of tuberculosis, we've seen the therapies and arsenal of medications that we've had really narrow with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and extremely multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And that's why a disease that happens in one country certainly impacts the entire world. The second is, had you asked me 12 months ago in the initial phases of this current pandemic if we'd have a vaccine available, not to say 3 vaccines within 12 months, I would have been a little bit skeptical. But the truth is we did, and it didn't just happen overnight. The investment in research for mRNA vaccines and the like has been going on for a while, and that really speaks to the commitment of making these investments in R&D and research, and how important that is. So, we're in the midst of addressing COVID-19, but as the prior speakers and my colleague Chairwoman DeLauro pointed out, the major morbidity from infectious disease historically has been tuberculosis, and now's the time for us to redouble our efforts to eliminate tuberculosis. That's why I am proud to be the co-chair of the TB Elimination Caucus with my Republican counterpart, Don Young. And as such, we'll be introducing an appropriations letter to fully fund the CDC at the $250 million level, but in addition, asking for $1 billion to go to USAID to help with our efforts to combat tuberculosis globally. We think these are reasonable requests. We think if we want to get to that ultimate goal of eliminating tuberculosis, this is the type of investment that we ought to be making. Also, in the next few weeks, we'll be reintroducing the Comprehensive Tuberculosis Elimination Act, which again emphasizes the important work of the CDC and the importance of making these funding requests, but also starts to look at how we better coordinate between state tuberculosis programs and community health centers that are on the front lines, renews the U.S. strategy to eliminate tuberculosis, and it also engages the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, in the U.S. and federal TB research and development agendas. And I know this from my time as Chief Medical Officer for Sacramento County, when we did have an outbreak in the county of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and having to implement the protocols, do the contact tracing, putting in programs within our chest clinic to look at folks in the homeless population and our shelter population, and particularly vulnerable folks. So this work's incredibly important, both for us to protect our domestic populations, but also to address this, as folks have said through millennia, a leading cause of morbidity or mortality around the world. So I look forward to working with Congresswoman DeLauro as we go through the appropriations process to get robust funding. I also look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress and Congressman Young to really get the Comprehensive Tuberculosis Elimination Act across the finish line. And lastly, I had a chance to chat earlier with Dr. Niaid about the important work of the consortium, and you'll hear later on about Trial 31, which is proving to be remarkable in terms of advancing therapy and getting to form a therapeutic regimen. That's the type of program and multi-institutional consortiums that we have to continue funding. And I look forward to continuing to work with the consortium and UCSF and Vanderbilt and others to continue to make sure we get that funding out to them. So with that, let me turn it back over, and I will stay on for questions.
Thank you, Congressman. It's appreciate your comments. We will get back to questions after we've gone through two other speakers. So if you can stay with us. I'm going to quickly introduce Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been kind enough to present a taped delivery. As people know, he's the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in Bethesda at the NIH, where he has overseen the research portfolio focused on infectious and immune-related diseases really since the late 80s. As a longtime chief of NIAID, laboratory immunoregulation, Dr. Fauci has made many seminal contributions in basic and clinical research and is probably one of the most highly cited biomedical scientists living today. He was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which I had the honor to serve as the director for, and has really been instrumental in maintaining that attention and funding for international programs that impact morbidity and mortality, largely funded by the United States. He's a personal friend and mentor to so many of us. I run the list long, but want to say how deeply we appreciate the role he's played in the last year in orchestrating and potentiating the response to COVID in the United States and abroad. So with that, we'll play Dr. Fauci's piece.
Warm greetings to you all. I am delighted to have this opportunity to offer brief remarks on this special day when we reflect on the devastating impact tuberculosis has had and continues to have on human health and the significant progress that is being made in combating this tragic disease. I do not need to tell you that the past year has been unlike any other we have experienced in our lifetimes. COVID-19 has taken far too many lives, strained healthcare systems, had tremendous economic consequences, and disrupted many aspects of normal life. It will almost certainly take years to appreciate the full public health impact of this pandemic. However, even if we were not in the grip of this historic pandemic of COVID-19, I would still be standing here today to remind you that TB is the top infectious disease killer in the world and has taken the lives of over 1 billion people throughout history, a fact that many do not appreciate. Despite heroic efforts by healthcare workers around the world, we know that COVID-19 is reducing access to TB services and that biomedical research on TB has experienced significant disruptions. Although the pandemic has slowed progress toward the goal of reaching a tuberculosis-free world, it is important to remember that just a short time ago, the TB field had gained considerable momentum from several significant scientific advances and research investments. In fact, just before the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, I wrote a perspective entitled 2019, a banner year for tuberculosis, because 2019 marked a period of extraordinary progress for the field. Although progress slowed, it did not stop, and I would like to take a minute to briefly highlight a couple of scientific advances and new programs that were launched in the past year. In the area of therapeutics, a phase 3 trial conducted by the CDC in collaboration with the NIH AIDS Clinical Trials Group, ACTG, found that a novel 4-month regimen containing moxifloxacin and rifapentine is as safe and effective as the standard 6-month regimen at curing drug-susceptible TB. This landmark finding is the first treatment-shortening regimen identified in nearly 40 years and paves the way for future studies already in planning to further improve on these results. Despite many recent advances in diagnostics, over 3 million people with active TB go undiagnosed or are not officially reported to national authorities each year. These so-called missing 3 million drive TB transmission, including multiple drug-resistant TB, and many die without receiving appropriate care. Although the causes are multifactorial, there is an urgent need for rapid point-of-care, accurate, and inexpensive diagnostics to reach these individuals. To address this need, in 2020, NIAID launched the Fend for TB program to accelerate the development of novel TB diagnostics. This program supports 3 centers, one of which is UCSF, that provide clinical site capacity in 12 TB endemic countries to evaluate a broad range of assays and biomarkers. The centers also provide a pathway whereby diagnostic technology holders may submit additional novel assays for evaluation. One of the many recent advances in TB vaccines, most notable, was the landmark Phase 2 trial, which found that immunization of MTB-infected adults with the M72AS01E vaccine provided 50% protection against the development of active confirmed TB disease after 3 years of follow-up. In partnership with the Gates Medical Research Institute and other global partners, NIAID is supporting studies to identify correlates of protection that will be critical to developing next-generation vaccine candidates. I also want to take a moment to highlight studies conducted at the NIAID Vaccine Research Center. Recently, scientists there showed that administering the BCG vaccine intravenously rather than intradermally, as it is normally given to young children, provided almost complete protection in highly susceptible rhesus macaques challenged with MTB. Studies are now underway to understand the unprecedented level of protection seen in these studies. As outlined in NIAID's strategic plan for tuberculosis, central to addressing the many challenges in the TB field is the need to support the next generation of TB investigators. This year, NIAID announced a new initiative to support the Tuberculosis Research Advancement Centers, or TRACs, modeled after the highly successful NIAID Centers for HIV/AIDS Research, or the CFAR program. Like CFAR, these new centers will provide exceptional mentorship to talented young investigators and foster multidisciplinary collaboration to address the highest scientific priorities in the field. I would like to close by emphasizing that although there have been setbacks over the last year, we must ensure that they are only temporary. As we emerge from this COVID-19 pandemic, we must continue to build on the recent successes from the TB field and leverage the many technological advances, data sharing practices, and global collaboration that have enabled such unprecedented speed in fighting SARS-CoV-2, particularly in the field of vaccinology. The challenges TB presents are daunting, and the needs are many. To reach our goals will require a renewed effort, stronger determination, greater collaboration, and significant investment. On this World TB Day, we must stand together to make sure that recent progress does not slip away and that we accelerate an end to TB.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Fauci. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Phil Hopewell, Professor of Medicine at the University of California, and practices pulmonary and critical care medicine at San Francisco General Hospital. He's the founding director of the Curry International Tuberculosis Center at UCSF, which provides education, technical assistance, and training in TB to domestic and international audiences. He's previous president of the American Thoracic Society. His career has focused on clinical and epidemiologic studies of TB and HIV-associated pulmonary conditions in both low incidence and high incidence settings. Dr. Hopewell is truly, as Dr. Fauci, one of those that bridges the clinician scientist in a way that is evolving into much more difficult to realize now. And he's really been a mentor for so many people at UCSF across the country and internationally that he truly does fit that clinician scientist mold. So thank you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Eric. I'm quite pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. Dr. Swaminathan is the Chief Scientist for the World Health Organization. She's the first occupant of that position that was created just 2 years ago. In that position, Dr. Swaminathan is charged with overseeing how WHO gathers scientific evidence and creates guidelines. It's one of the primary responsibilities of the organization is to provide these guidelines in the whole range of diseases that are of importance throughout the world. Dr. Swaminathan is extraordinarily well qualified for this job, bringing 30 years of experience as a clinician. And I should mention that she's trained as a pediatric pulmonologist, but also an investigator, research administrator, bringing this broad range of experience to this new and critically important unit within WHO. This broad experience enables Dr. Swaminathan to think and plan beyond the research findings to their translation to policies and programs and the requirements necessary for implementation. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you, Payam, and greetings to Dr. Goosby as well. It's lovely to see so many friends and fellow warriors, I guess, in the battle against TB, and many of us have been carrying on in this fight for many, many years now. It's been inspiring to hear the comments of the previous speakers, and Dr. Fauci, as usual, covered so much ground on the advances in science in the few minutes that he spoke. Unfortunately, if we were to talk about COVID and we tried to cover all the scientific advances in 5 minutes, it wouldn't be possible because there's been so much work done, there's so much research, so much global collaboration, and so much of the science, the development of new tools, all of that done in an incredible 12 months, under 12 months, actually. We have genomic sequencing around the world. You can go online on Gisaid, and there are currently over 700,000 whole genome sequences. Scientists are tracking the viral evolution, literally on a minute-by-minute basis. New vaccines are being developed every day. There are global platform trials going on, including the one that's run by WHO, the Solidarity Trial, across 30 countries, looking at repurposed drugs and eventually new drugs that could be developed for COVID-19. It's just been an incredible year of scientific progress, and it's all the more painful to think about why we haven't been able to do this as a global community for TB. And on World TB Day, I always think back to some of my patients because I've worked all my life in India in both pediatric and adult patients with TB, many of them HIV co-infected, but most of them not, with the underlying risk factor being malnutrition, really accounting for over 50% of TB incidence in India and in many countries where HIV is not the driving factor for TB, including, I'm sure, in the United States, where TB does affect the most vulnerable, the people coming, with the most risk factors and the social determinants of disease. So it's not, and we all know that scientifically it's a challenging infection and that we still don't understand the immune response. We don't have the kind of clear ideas about the correlates of protection that we have for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, for example. And that makes it so much more challenging to run clinical trials and develop new vaccines. In 2020, we were to have achieved already, according to the global targets, a reduction of TB incidence by 20%. We were not on track. We had achieved a reduction of 9%, but we were making some progress. We should have reduced deaths by 25%. We were down by 14%. Again, some progress. And we should have invested every year $13 billion US dollars for the control of TB, and we have been achieving approximately half of that. And similarly, the R&D global target was $2 billion a year, and we've been achieving less than half of that. And I think Payam mentioned at the beginning about the investments that have gone into COVID-19 R&D, well over a 90 or $100 billion, but we're still under $1 billion for TB. Now, what happened in 2020 was, of course, in 12 months, we've wiped out 12 years of progress in TB, unfortunately. And we're huge drops in case detection. So normally, we were having case notifications of over 7 million of the estimated 10 million cases a year to WHO. We had 1.4 million less notifications last year, particularly from the TB high burden countries. Dramatic reductions because of lockdowns, because of diversion of resources, manpower, diagnostic, gene expert machines were repurposed, TB community health workers were repurposed, funding was moved over, R&D, all scientists started working on COVID. So of those 1.4 million missing cases, we estimate there could be up to 500,000 people who actually died because they were not able to get a diagnosis or care for TB. Pediatric TB, we were actually doing much worse because we were hardly detecting and treating. I think MDR TB in children, we were detecting something globally, 8% of the estimated total number of children who have MDR TB. Pediatricians, I remember the first study I did that showed a prevalence of MDR TB among children in city hospitals in Chennai. It was met with incredulity and disbelief. Pediatricians did not believe that children would have MDR TB because it's just a mindset, and of course we all know that primary MDR TB is children get it from transmission from their adult contacts. So we are currently in a very dangerous situation where essential health services have been disrupted. The WHO did a pulse survey in the middle of last year, and we've repeated it again last month to see how much essential services have still been hit. In the middle of last year, it was dramatic, and much more so, of course, in low-income countries. This impacted not only TB care and services, but it impacted a lot of other malaria, non-communicable diseases, cancer, essential surgery. So we really need to catch up if we are not to lose the battle. We have the 2030 targets of 95% reduction of deaths and 90% reduction in cases. And unfortunately, we will have to work really very hard and move on all the things that Dr. Fauci talked about. I was thinking about the rapid diagnostics tests that we have now for COVID. CRISPR has been used as a diagnostic. All the latest technology is being put to use. There are paper-based diagnostics now where you can actually look for specific mutations in the SARS-CoV-2 virus to pick up these variants. We've done dozens of clinical trials. There's 70 vaccines currently in clinical development, and of course 10 vaccines being used across the world. And therapeutics, we haven't had that much success, but there are a couple of antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, etc., that are in the works. So it can be done, but we've taken years after the initial results of the BCG revaccination study and the M72 vaccine trial to launch further studies, phase 3 definitive trials, to prove whether either of those approaches work. The intravenous BCG data is also very potentially very interesting and needs to be taken up, but somehow it just doesn't seem to have the same urgency. Finally, I just want to say that TB is, of course, a disease that's caused by a pathogen, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it produces illness. It is a biomedical interventions that we've been talking about, but we have to remember that it is a disease that's driven by all of these risk factors like undernutrition that I mentioned. And one of the fallouts of the pandemic is going to be increasing rates of hunger, of poverty, and of undernutrition. And that is very, very frightening because it may drive up TB incidence further. So the Secretary General of the United Nations actually just a couple of months ago put out a call to all countries with 10 priority recommendations that countries really need to pay attention to. The first one was around political leadership and making sure that TB stays high on the agenda and driving a multi-sectoral action to end TB and TB deaths in particular, because it's clear that it has to be a multi-sectoral response, starting from nutrition and social support and ensuring that these people are free of stigma and discrimination, that they have access to quality essential health services. Then he said we need to increase funding, particularly for health workforce, because we've seen how health workforce has been completely mobilized. We need to advance universal health coverage, because without universal health coverage, people are not going to have access to quality services for diagnosis and treatment. We need to address the drug-resistant TB crisis, to close the gaps in care, to dramatically scale up preventive treatment for TB. We're doing miserably as far as preventive therapy is concerned. Promote human rights, combat stigma and discrimination, ensure meaningful engagement of civil society and communities, people affected by TB, increase investments in TB research, ensure that TB prevention and care are safeguarded in the context of COVID-19 and other emerging threats. And finally, of course, the UN Secretary General requested that WHO provide that global leadership and convene a meeting of all member states at the UN in 2023 to take stock of the progress that's been made and assess where we are in terms of achieving the SDGs. So I will stop my comments here, Eric and Phil, and hand back to you, and happy to take questions or comments later. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Really a wonderful overview and down to specifics that cross the depth and breadth of the TB challenges. I'd like to ask one question to both of you, Congressman Bera as well as to Sumaya. I think you expressed really beautifully the frustration that those of us who work in the TB arena, in whatever corner, with the accelerated response that we saw with COVID. We applaud the response, but at the same time, we couldn't help but take note, as we have done, as we occurred with HIV before it, where you see countries mobilizing resources, displacing commitments already made, and putting them toward the larger threat, an appropriate response by a political body. But what's missing is the discussion that swings the pendulum back. And I love the way you rose the role that universal health coverage plays in keeping those essential services available to larger portions of the population. But what can an academic medical center focused institution do to arm you better in both US congressional appropriations discussions as well as multilateral discussions in resource allocation, to shift the attention to increase resources and focus on TB, but at the same time, understanding what's being given up in the broader effort that includes COVID and other diseases that have already been committed to? Kind of that big question. And I'm just curious for you to kind of roughly go over both of those arenas, and feel free to take any aspect of that you want. We'll start with Congressman Bera.
Great. I think the points that you made, Dr. Goosby, as well as the points Dr. Swaminathan made, is you've seen this incredible effort and diversion of resources to fight SARS-CoV-2. And we're going to spend billions of dollars, and we will embark on what will be the largest vaccination campaign in our history. I think what we can learn from this, as we spend billions of dollars to vaccinate the world, to build that global vaccine workforce and a global, let's be strategic about this. Let's not just, focus on COVID-19. Let's also, as we invest billions of dollars around the world, let's look at the assets in these countries. As we train up a public health, global health workforce, let's also be very strategic. And, as someone who spent my time in Congress, trying to work on global health security and pandemic preparedness, it was always very hard to get the attention of many of my colleagues to understand this. They've all now experienced the impact of a global pandemic. And we know that this isn't the last pandemic. In fact, many of us anticipate with climate change, with population and the like, we will increasingly see additional pandemics. So as we start to invest in that global health delivery system, we should, and looking at pandemic preparedness, we should also be looking at other infectious diseases. The last thing that I would think about is, Dr. Swaminathan touched on a number of things that COVID-19 really has diverted attention from tuberculosis, malaria, and other infectious diseases around the world. That has set us back. As we redouble our efforts here, I think we also have to understand the secondary impact of COVID-19, the massive food insecurity that we're seeing around the world that will make populations very susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis, the large refugee populations and the number of displaced people around the world, and how we address that, again, making people particularly susceptible to these diseases, and then how we rebuild and reinvigorate multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization and others, because again, the world is interconnected, and I think COVID-19's demonstrated that. So it's not one country, but how do we get many countries working together to address these killers? So,
thank you, Congressman. Dr. Swaminathan.
Yes, I agree with what Congressman Bera has said, and he's laid out, many things that can be done. I think the role of a center of excellence like the UCSF is in many of these areas is to provide the scientific solutions that we need actually for us to reach those TB targets and elimination goals. So there is really a need for much more, I think, focused, but also globally coordinated large research studies. And again, I think taking the clues that we've learned from COVID-19 and the way the world has actually been able to organize itself quite well, and it just happened naturally. We did play a role in bringing people together right at the beginning, laying out a research roadmap for COVID and so on. There is, I think, a lot of scope to test innovations in TB. Today, we've come out with a guide on screening for TB, because we recognize that countries will really have to step up their screening and diagnosis and use molecular diagnostics. One of the things that's happened is that digital tools have become much more broadly utilized by health systems. And for example, in India now, they're using artificial intelligence to read chest radiographs, or they're using teleradiography to read these radiographs overnight, so that next morning you have the x-rays that have been read, and then using all these apps now that have been developed for contact tracing, for example, will enable us to do contact tracing, contacts of TB patients, keep in touch with them through mobile phones. So those kind of innovations that have been tested for COVID could be deployed, but we need to do these studies to prove that they actually work. So I think there is a lot to be done for the science, advancing the trials for vaccines and so on, that UCSF and other leading institutions could do as a network, really. And if the funding comes through from the NIH and there's global funding through the CDC, then it's possible to advance that. But at the same time, I think we need to keep advocating for the multi-sectoral approach to TB. TB is a disease of the vulnerable, and unfortunately, those inequities are widening as a result of COVID. And things like the role of nutrition, not just in preventing TB, but also in helping people recover from TB. These have not been well studied. There have been studies done around the First World War that actually showed the clear relationship between people who were getting very poor diets and who were literally starving and the risk of contracting TB or dying from it. And there's a lot of data that shows the relationship, but there are hardly any intervention studies that have been able to show the impact of better nutrition. So there are lots of gaps in science that need to be filled, but at the same time, we need to step up the programmatic implementation. And we believe at the WHO that universal health coverage, will take care of all the problems, because we can't do TB at the with consequences on other diseases like malaria. So it shouldn't be a zero-sum game, really, but the investments into health really need to increase in a holistic way.
Thank you, Smaya. Phil or Payam, do you have anything you wanted to add to that discussion, or should we move on to the next agenda item?
Well,
Phil,
I'll quickly say that the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the weaknesses in the global preparedness for infectious diseases, domestically and internationally. And I think, I look back at the very nice editorial that Bill Gates wrote in the New England Journal last year, where he frankly just laid it out as billions of dollars invested in anti-pandemic efforts is a lot of money, but actually it's a bargain when you consider the economic pain these pandemics have on everything from global economies in the macro level to the individual's life and devastation financially that they experience at home. So, it's a bargain. It's a no-brainer investing in preparedness for these pandemics. And I like what you said, Eric, Congressman Bera said, we should take the mindset that we had since COVID-19 and accelerate things for TB.
Phil, anything to add to that?
No, I think that it's similar to what Payam just said and what Representative Bera said as well, and that is that we need to adjust our thinking to the recognizing the fact that what we consider to be the aberrancy, which is the pandemic, is actually the normal, because quite clearly we've just in our lifetimes had a large number of epidemic and pandemic diseases that have really undermined or exposed, as Payam said, the weaknesses of healthcare systems around the world. And we just need to accept the fact that we need to operate as if the pandemic is the normal and the inter-pandemic quiet period, the abnormal, the aberrancy.
Thank you for that. So, Payam, I'll turn this back over to you to continue through the agenda.
Thanks very much, Eric. Dr. Swaminathan, Dr. Bera, Congressman Bera, Phil, for a first session. I'd like to now switch over to our colleagues and friends in London who are joining us. Professor Mark Lipman, Director of UCL TB, University College London, and Dr. Finn McQuaid, Co-Director of the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine TB Center, are kindly joining us late in the evening in London to provide us a brief summary of their joint World TB Day Symposium held earlier today. Mark and Finn, thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really great for us to be able to maintain this link between UCSF and the LSHTM TB Center and UCL TB. It's definitely a relationship that on our side of the pond we really value. I'd just like to give you a quick flavor of our event and some of the highlights. I think you can already tell there's been a lot of synergy with what we've heard this morning. A recording of this will also be available on the LSHTM TB Center website shortly. So we began by listening to a range of patient and healthcare provider perspectives from Zambia, Gambia, and London. This was a real variety of voices speaking to both positive and negative experiences, was certainly not homogeneous. And for me, as a TB modeler, it really highlighted the importance of a people-centered approach to the TB response. And as Chancellor Horgood has already suggested, it put a personal face to TB. With this in mind, I'm particularly looking forward to Dr. Kelly Holland's talk later in the program. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, session 2 picked up on something that Dr. Fauci was discussing, finding the missing millions, and the 3 presentations there. The first one was on looking in the homeless population in Romania. Second one was at a population level in Karachi, Pakistan. And the third was Professor Helen Ailes highlighting some of the work that's been done in Zambia together with Zambian universities over the last 15 years. Interestingly, the guidelines that Dr. Swaminathan just mentioned about screening for TB, those arose directly in part from the work that Helen presented. Another group that also were key to our presentation was Dr. Emily Wong, presented from the Africa Health Research Institute in South Africa, and again brought another perspective in terms of population-based tuberculosis and its interaction in terms of multimorbidities. Here she was looking at HIV, diabetes, hypertension, and tuberculosis, and showed some remarkable data where instead of it always clustering as you might expect, there were really quite wide variability depending on the population and some of the background cofactors. Finn.
Thank you. So in the third session, it was taking a bit of a closer look at the TB natural history paradigm. As this began with Hanif Esmail talking about bacteriologically negative disease, identifying this. And there was then a discussion from John Emery on transmission of subclinical TB, also from Dr. Emily Wong, as Mark has already mentioned, and this Vukozazi project. And then ending with Helen Fletcher thinking about what these mean for the future of TB vaccines. So for me, this just really highlighted the spectrum of TB disease. We really can't think of it as neatly compartmentalized anymore. This discussion's been progressing in recent years and developing, but we really need to move our thinking forward and our language forward in this area in TB natural history. And this is important in a number of areas. It's important in terms of finding cases where we know, as has already been mentioned, that there's a large undiagnosed TB burden out there, which has been made worse by COVID. But it's also important in thinking about, similar to SARS-CoV-2, thinking about ongoing MTB transmission and where that comes from. And this has real consequences for TB control efforts as well. So Mark, back to you.
Thank you. And the final session was accelerating drug discovery and development. And here there was a discussion by Dana Klug about the open source TB research, where instead of working through patents, actually it goes the other way. So everything is open source and available, an exciting approach. That was then followed on by Professor Anil Kool, who described the 15-year development of bedaquiline, which then segued very nicely into Angela Crook discussing the work for the NICS-TB study of protomidid, bedaquiline, and linezolid. And of course, the treatment shortening regimens for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Just today, MSF have described Practical having a very positive outcome, a 6-month regimen of 4 drugs for drug-resistant TB. And again, this is obviously a very relevant theme in terms of what Payam will be discussing later in TBTC31, which is incredibly exciting. So really, really revolutionizing how we think about tuberculosis and how we treat it. And again, it comes back to the people at the sharp end, the patients and their families and friends and communities who are experiencing TB, which is after all what we do this all for, I think. thank you again for letting us speak to you and attend your fantastic meeting. And I know on behalf of both the School of Hygiene and also UCL, we really appreciate this link. So let's keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Finn, for joining us. You reinforce our bilateral partnerships, UK and US. I now hand the session moderation over to Patrick Phillips, Assistant Professor at UCSF. To you.
Thank you, Payam. Thank you very much. We continue into our second session. We continue with our star-studded lineup, now highlighting some of the exciting scientific research going on within UCSF. We're running this next session as a lightning round session, so one presenter speaking after the other. We don't have time for questions within this session, but I really encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to add questions. There is a combined Q&A research panel, a discussion panel at the end of our symposium. So please do add your questions there, clicking on the Q&A button. And the speakers may be able to respond in the chat box during the session, or they can be raised in the discussion at the end. I'll very briefly introduce our speakers before moving into the session. If you do need to see more about them, I'd encourage you to check their profile pages on the UCSF website, because I only have time for very brief introductions. Our first speaker is Dr. Babak Javid. Babak is Associate Director of the UCSF Center for Tuberculosis and a physician scientist, and he joined UCSF as Associate Professor in the Division of Experimental Medicine just in July of last year. Our second speaker is Dr. Rada Savic. Rada is also an Associate Director of UCSF Center for Tuberculosis and is a Professor in the Department of Bioengineering and Therapeutic Sciences, and also the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at UCSF. And our third speaker is Dr. Joel Ernst. Originally from UCSF, Joel returned to UCSF in 2018, and he serves as the Chief of the Division of Experimental Medicine within the UCSF Center for Tuberculosis. And so what I will do, I'll hand over to Babak, who'll speak first, and then we'll go through the three speakers in turn. But I would encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of the symposium. Over to you, Babak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for a very kind introduction. And in the spirit of the lightning round, I'll head straight into my talk. And this is really, part of my research is really about the fundamental molecular biology of tuberculosis and how very fundamental cellular systems allow TB to adapt to either drug treatment or the hostile environment of the host. And just to sort of very briefly overview, the fundamental central dogma of molecular biology is that genetic information in the form of DNA is first transcribed into ribonucleic acid, RNA, and then translated into functional proteins. And these proteins are what do most of the job in any cell of any organism, including Mycobacterium tuberculosis that causes TB. And my lab is interested in when this central dogma goes wrong, when we get a stretch of DNA that codes for something and is transcribed into RNA without any problems, and then is translated into a functional protein as it's coded. But when this goes wrong, you can actually get a slightly different protein that only varies by single amino acid, but that single amino acid can cause a change in the function of that subpopulation of proteins that have undergone the change. And just to put this in context, the very first effective TB drug, streptomycin, which was trialed in the first ever randomized controlled trial by the MRC in the 1940s, works by increasing this mistranslation or translational error rate in TB, and that's how it kills the TB bacterium. So paradoxically, what we think is that we think that a gene codes for multiple copies of identical proteins, but due to these stochastic errors that happen even in the absence of drugs, you actually get a number of different related proteins that are approximately the same, but occasionally get a change that causes the function, as I said, of a subpopulation of these proteins. And that's what we're interested in studying in my lab in TB. And some years ago, what I discovered is that the error rate in Mycobacteria is remarkably high. It's in the order of 1 to 2% per codon, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually means that even at these error rates, about 70% of the proteins the TB bacterium makes are incorrect. They don't correspond to the coded gene. And what we showed is that these subtle increases in error rates are sufficient to massively, by several orders of magnitude, increase the ability of the Mycobacteria to resist killing by the first-line drug rifampicin. And these rifamycins were discovered about 50 years ago and are still the backbone of TB treatment. And in fact, the study that Payam will talk about later in part involved the change in dose of these rifamycins to accelerate TB treatment. So what we can see is that these error rates in Mycobacteria actually allow the Mycobacteria to resist killing by this first-line drug. And when I set up my lab initially in Tsinghua University in Beijing, one of the first projects we embarked on with a graduate student of mine is to try to identify mutants, genetic mutants in Mycobacteria, which had an even higher than this already very high background error rate. I won't go into the details of the screen for the sake of brevity, but just to say that my talented former graduate student Hong Wei found several mutants which had mutations in the exact same gene, GAT-A, and these mutants had really extraordinary error rates, up to 10% per codon. And at this type of error rate, every single protein in the cell is being produced aberrantly, and yet these bacteria are still able to grow and survive, and in fact thrive in the context of antibiotic treatment. And what does GAT-A do? Well, the central step in molecular biology in the central dogma is when an enzyme, a tRNA synthetase, recognizes the tRNA molecule, that's the adapter for translating the genetic code, and ligates it to its cognate or correct amino acid. But in fact, Mycobacteria, the bacteria that cause TB, don't have the specific enzymes for glutamine or asparagine, which are 2 of the 20 amino acids that make proteins. And instead, they use an indirect pathway where the same enzyme recognizes both the glutamate and glutamine tRNAs, but puts the same amino acid on both. And this is the wrong amino acid on this tRNA, glutamine. And a second enzyme recognizes this mistake and corrects it. And Hong Wei had identified mutations in this enzyme that were causing this very high error rate. And what Hong Wei showed is that actually many clinical isolates of TB, so these are disease-causing strains identified from patients, have mutations in this pathway and have both increased rates of error, but also increased resistance to this first-line drug rifampin, which potentially causes these patients to relapse and not be effectively cured with the standard regimen. At the same time as doing these studies, we wanted to ask the paradoxical question: instead of increasing the mistranslation rate like streptomycin does, can we actually decrease the error rate with a new drug? This was a very coordinated effort by a lot of people, and we did find a natural molecule, a naturally occurring molecule called Kasugamycin that does, in this very nice dose-dependent way, decrease the error rate in Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And what we showed is that giving this drug in mice can boost the effectiveness of rifampicin by up to 50-fold, which is really quite remarkable. It's as good as putting 2 or 3 extra drugs in. But there are unfortunately toxicity issues with this drug, even in mice, which means we can't translate this into human trials straight away. We can also show that the error rate in TB goes up when it infects mice, and we can actually use Kasugamycin to treat mice And we can show that when we give Kasugamycin to mice, it actually, on its own, without any additional drugs, restricts the ability of the TB to grow in the mice, despite the fact that we're giving it at a dose that is far below the concentration that's needed for this to work as an antibiotic. So this is working as a completely novel mechanism as an antivirulent strategy. So to summarize, TB uses errors in translation to adapt to hostile environments, both antibiotics and the host. We can actually target this pathway with small molecules as a novel antivirulent strategy and to limit resistance in data that haven't shown. And also importantly, TB research allows discovery of new biology that can also be applicable to other disease areas as well. These are my funders and the people who did the work, and this is my new lab at UCSF. Thank you so much. And I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Radha Savage.
Thank you so much, Babak. Let's share my screen quickly, and thank you all for attending. I will also jump straight into my talk, and I will talk about TB therapeutics and novelties in tool development for translation of TB treatment response. I think, as you've heard today, no matter how grim are times, but for TB drug development, actually very exciting times. We already heard several times we have first ever 4-month regimen available for drug sensitive TB. Not to forget, we also have a new first ever 6-month regimen for treatment of XDR and MDR TB, and as of today, even a new regimen for treatment of MDR TB from Practical TB Study. So shorter is possible, which gives us really a lot of hope. But looking in a pipeline, now we want to go even further and won't even get shorter, because that's really the best strategy for eradicating TB and treating TB. The pipelines are richer than ever. Only in clinical trial development, in clinical stage, we have around 12 new drugs. And not only new drugs, but also drugs with new mechanism of actions. And that really has never been the case before. And finally, not only do we have all of these new drugs and new tools, we also have novel partnerships, which are a combination of pharma industry, academic institutions, and non-governmental organizations, which are very committed to work together and develop new treatments. So it is truly exciting. However, we have also a problem, which is now something we never dealt in TB, which is we have too many options. And thinking about joint regimen development programs, when we have 8 to 12 novel compounds which are in the clinic, and where's the will to combine all of these compounds and potentially new regimens, now we have a problem, mathematical problem, which is optimization combinatorics, and we have too many options. Just if you think about if we have 12 compounds that can be studied at different doses, and we try and think about how to combine different drugs at different doses for different treatment duration and also different frequencies of the drug use, before you think we have actually more than 1 million potential combinations to study. And that's something which is clearly not possible. And what do we do, and how do we rank order, and how do we make choices to utilize our resources which are clearly limited? So to help with that, I also think it's wonderful, exciting times, because we have a variety of new animal models and tools, such as we have a new sort of mouse models where we can study treatment response, including chronic lesion mouse model. We have a wonderful new tool, a rabbit model to study lesion penetration. We have several new in vitro assays that can help us understand drug combinations. And all of these tools are aimed to help translate TB treatment response and to understand and predict how some of these compounds and drug combination will behave in people. However, that is not enough. I think what has been lacking, and finally we are developing those, is a very strong predictive and quantitative link of all of these tools to clinical trials. Because it's not enough just to say this is better, this regimen is better than the other one. What we need to do is actually, this regimen is a promising 3-month regimen, because that's where we want to go next. And to that topic, I want to highlight some of these new quantitative translational toolboxes which have been developed over last decade, and which will be very applicable and helpful for this big good problem to have of too many options. And this toolbox can be divided in different buckets depending what scientists are interested, but only by thinking about all of these parts of TB treatment response, such as lesion penetration, immunology, exposure response, drug combinations, resistance development, biomarkers that we measure in a mouse versus clinical trials. Only by integrating all of these tools, we can actually do a good translation. And to that topic, I would like to highlight some of the novel machine learning and AI tools which have been developed for regimen ranking in a mouse model. And the beauty with these tools is that these algorithms, they can be trained based on clearly large mouse databases of many different compounds. And they can provide prediction of potential combinations that have not been studied yet. So you don't have to study every single combination in a mouse model, in a rabbit model. And you can, with smart design, you can actually get predictions what good drug combinations would be in order, and not only what they would be in terms of their rank, it would be also what they're, are they good enough to actually deliver us 2-month treatment duration for drug-sensitive TB. And this is very, very exciting. On one of the other tools, we also have beautiful imaging studies that they're able to be performed in lung resection, rabbit studies, and we have another quantitative tool, which is these studies linked with very powerful modeling. They can help us understand what drug combinations are very good to cover the TB lesions and ensure sterilization of these really hard to treat and hard to reach lesions. And there's been really wonderful developments in that specific arena. Going one step further, the development of new quantitative immunology and pharmacology models, now we come to space we can actually predict. We can predict clinical trial results, and this is really something that is very helpful because it actually provides quantitative ranking of what regimens are reasonable to advance into clinical trials, and the promising in terms of 2 or 3 months treatment duration. And application of these tools have already been done and linked to some of the successful trials that are out there. Clearly, nothing of this would be possible if we also don't start innovative in clinical trial arena, and if we don't consider new clinical trial designs that can feed back into these translational platforms and enhance the learning. And we've seen development of some really innovative clinical trial designs, phase 2A+ designs, as well as phase 2C designs, which will enable us better learning and better understanding of preclinical drug development and better drug selection. And finally, last but not the least, we've heard earlier today about power of data sharing and how that needs to happen, and it has happened in TB, and we just have to keep doing it. Power of data sharing has been demonstrating in TB Reflect initiatives, where some wonderful findings have been come out and opened the door to stratified approaches to TB treatment as an option to bring cure to all patients. So just to sum up, we have really a good problem nowadays, and the translation from preclinical to clinical trials is very complex. However, linked with computational tools and data science approaches, it's really opening the door to a very positive, optimistic era for TB drug development. And with that, I would like to thank all my funders, my wonderful, amazing lab, UCSF TB Center, and collaborators at many different institutions. Thank you for listening. And I will hand over now to Dr. Ernst. Joel, to you.
Thank you, Rana. I can start with the first slide. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I'll talk a bit about progress in TB vaccine development and immunology. And I'll start by just asking or posing the question, is it possible to make a TB vaccine that works? And this was a serious question raised by the results of a study that was published in 2013 that used a novel approach to TB vaccine and had unfortunately 0% efficacy in preventing tuberculosis, either in infants or in HIV-infected adults. And so this raised the question whether vaccine development was actually going to be possible for TB. Next slide, please. And so what I'll tell you about is some activities that I think address that question. And I'll just mention that there are really two overall approaches to TB vaccine development and testing. One strategy is to develop vaccines with the intent of preventing infection. And so in this case, we detect infection indirectly. And in the studies that have been done so far, the indirect test of infection has been the conversion of a tuberculin skin test or quantiferon test from negative to positive during the course of the study, after either vaccination or being randomized to a control group. Now, in the results that I'll show you, there is kind of a new definition, and that is sustained infection, because we know that some people actually have unstable or they revert from a quantiferon positive to a quantiferon negative test. And that's thought possibly to reflect elimination of the bacteria. The second category of strategy is to prevent disease. That is to say, prevent progression from infection or latent infection to active TB disease. And this really is a realistic acknowledgement that it's too late to prevent infection in 20% or so of the world's population who are already infected. So we need a vaccine that would reach and benefit that population. And I'll just make the comment here that we can't assume that the same vaccine will be optimal for both of those uses. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about one of the vaccine trials that Dr. Fauci referred to earlier and just very briefly mentioned. This was a prevention of infection trial. It was done in adolescents in South Africa at high risk of becoming newly infected. And it compared a vaccine titled IC31, which was a purified protein in adjuvant vaccine, compared with BCG revaccination. Now, this is a group that received BCG during infancy, but they were being revaccinated as part of this trial during adolescence. So these were quantiferon negative, so uninfected adolescents at high risk of infection. The two vaccines were compared with placebo, and the primary endpoint was the prevention of quantiferon conversion. Now, it turned out that neither of the experimental vaccine strategies prevented quantiferon conversion. But in fact, if you examine the secondary endpoint, and that is sustained quantiferon conversion, in other words, quantiferon conversion from negative to positive, and then reversion to negative again, the BCG revaccination strategy had an efficacy of approximately 48%. In other words, roughly half of the people who received BCG revaccination had a sustained infection or sustained quantiferon conversion compared to the control group. The purified protein subunit vaccine had a lower efficacy. It wasn't trivial, but it didn't reach statistical significance in that trial. So this provides evidence that there is a genuine possibility of creating immunity that prevents infection per se. Now, the next slide shows the alternative strategy, and this is another of the trials that Dr. Fauci referred to, using the M72-AS01E combination. M72 is a fusion protein representing Mycobacterium tuberculosis proteins, and the ASO1E is an adjuvant, which is really meant to alert the immune system that a foreign protein has been presented. So this was a prevention of disease trial. So it enrolled people who were already infected as defined by quantiferon positivity. They were otherwise healthy adults. They were vaccinated with the recombinant protein subunit vaccine and followed, actually, it says here, active and passive surveillance for active TB for 2 years, but actually it's up now to 3 years follow-up. And what that showed is that prevention of disease could be prevented in approximately half of these adults over the course of 3 years by the M72 vaccine. So in addition to the prevention of infection strategy with revaccination with BCG, there is now evidence that there is a vaccine strategy that protects from against progression from infection to active disease, which is of course the transmissible form of TB. The next slide notes that in fact we have the potential of doing better. These are both animal studies. These are both studies that were done in non-human primate models of tuberculosis. And the one on the left was also mentioned by Dr. Fauci, and that was a strategy involving administration of BCG by various routes. And what you see on the left there is a plot of the lung bacterial burdens in the animals getting various vaccine strategies. And that gray area at the bottom is the area where no detectable bacteria were recovered from the lungs. And you'll see that IV administration of BCG actually resulted in sterile immunity. In other words, it prevented infection and recovery of any bacteria. Likewise, another strategy that used a cytomegalovirus vector to present or provide TB antigens also to non-human primates also resulted there in the plot there on the right side in sterile immunity. In other words, the lack of recovery of viable bacteria in animals that received these vaccines. So it's not thought terribly practical to give intravenous BCG as a global strategy for vaccination. On the other hand, both of these studies, I think, indicate that sterile immunity is possible. And if we can understand, and the studies are underway to understand, what mechanisms of immunity and what magnitude of those mechanisms of immunity were generated by these vaccine strategies, we can then aspire to mimic those with more practical approaches. So the next slide just notes the TB vaccine pipeline. We've got a relatively rich TB vaccine pipeline. It's not as rich as the COVID pipeline, and it's certainly not as successful so far as the COVID vaccine pipeline. But suffice it to say that there are multiple candidate vaccines at multiple stages of development. There are many more in preclinical development than are listed here. I'll also just note that of all of these candidates, there are only 4 that were actually developed in the United States. And I think that that is a challenge to us to make sure that we in the United States as TB investigators begin ramping up our efforts to contribute to TB vaccine development. The next slide then addresses that question. Is it possible to make a TB vaccine that works? The answer, I think, is absolutely yes. And the next slide shows an upcoming meeting that I would welcome anyone who's interested to participate in, because it's a virtual meeting this year, and that is the Global Forum on TB Vaccines that will be held in mid-April of this year. The next slide, I just want to give a brief comment on progress in human TB immunity that will, or immunology, that I think will help focus the development and testing of new TB vaccines. And that is a new focus on CD4 T cells that are a new group termed Th17 cells. They are T cells that secrete the cytokine interleukin 17. They have other functions too, but the interleukin 17 production is really their sort of defining characteristic. And several studies leading up to this have indicated that these T cells, the Th17 responses, are important factors and contributors to immunity to TB. One, I'm just citing this result from a study by Tom Scriba and his colleagues, analysis of gene expression in purified T cells revealed early suppression of Th17 responses in progressors. This was from a prospective cohort of people observed for progression or not progression. And so basically Th17 responses disappeared before people progressed, indicating that they were contributing to holding it under control prior to that. And then in an upcoming paper, a quote, a polyfunctional Th17-like effector state is reduced in abundance and function in individuals who have progressed from MTB infection to active disease. So that raises the question whether there are specific MTB antigens that are recognized by this specialized subset of Th17 CD4 T cells. And the next slide shows that in fact, human Th1, the familiar cells that we've been discussing for many years that make interferon gamma, and this new subset Th17 cells actually recognize distinct Mycobacterium tuberculosis antigens. This is work that was done here at UCSF by Paul Ogongo. And so these were cells from recent close contacts of people with active pulmonary tuberculosis. So they were latently infected, not sick, but nevertheless exposed and infected. And to just sort of state the results fairly simply, the results on the left show some of the sort of more traditionally studied antigens in TB immunology. And what you see is that many more people make interferon gamma in response or have interferon gamma producing T cells in response to those antigens. And fewer people have Th17 or IL-17 responses to those antigens. However, on the right side of the slide are 4 new antigens that have really been previously unexamined in detail in TB. And what Paul discovered is that those antigens actually induce a high frequency of IL-17 producing T cells. So the conclusion then is that optimal TB vaccines might require both Th1 and Th17 cell responses, and that informed selection of antigens for those vaccines might optimize their efficacy against TB. The next slide just summarizes that it is possible to make efficacious TB vaccines, so the effort is worthwhile, that there are multiple strategies that show potential, including BCG revaccination, protein subunit vaccines, a viral vector with multiple MTB antigens. And I'll just note that ongoing studies here at UCSF and elsewhere are defining optimal antigens and optimal immune responses for new generation TB vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. I'd like to thank our 3 speakers for their concise overviews of their research activities. And as I reflect, after our rightly dismal outlook in the TB epidemic that we heard about at the beginning of our symposium, it's really encouraging to hear, to see the positive light and to hear the opportunities for progress that we see now and really hope to see to come to fruition in the next few years. So thank you, Babak, Radha, and Joel for that. I would encourage you, we've had a number of questions come in already. I'd encourage all attendees to take advantage of the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So please do use that if you have questions for individual speakers or questions for the panel discussion at the end. And so it's my great pleasure now to introduce the moderator for our next session, Dr. Jenny Flood. Dr. Flood is the chief of the Tuberculosis Control Branch at the California Department of Public Health. She's an infectious disease specialist and clinical professor of medicine at UCSF and has provided clinical care for patients with TB for over 2 decades. And so I'm very grateful for her contribution today, and I'll hand over to Jenny. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. For this last session, we plan to spotlight clinical and population health topics, and I'm going to make introductions at lightning speed in advance of the presentation. So first up is Dr. Payam Niaid, who we know as a professor of medicine at UCSF and director of the UCSF Center for TB. He's been a scientific leader not only in TB clinical trials, but on practice guidelines for the nation and in international spheres. He'll present the hot news and bottom line on the trial of the shortest ever TB disease treatment. Next will be Dr. Kelly Holland, a physician and TB survivor who cares for patients at the Massachusetts Lynn Clinic. He will share his compelling perspective and hope for the shorter regimen. We then turn to TB in San Francisco. Dr. Janice Louie, Medical Director of the San Francisco TB Clinic, will tell us what the TB experience has been like during the pandemic as TB diagnosis plunged and disease advanced in San Francisco. And we really are still shocked, like the rest of the world, about the marked decline in TB this past year that coincided with the pandemic. And we have many questions on what will happen next. Finally, Doctors Aditya Kadamachi and Elizabeth Fair of UCSF will unveil some exciting new opportunities for TB research and mentoring. And now over to Payam.
Thanks, Jenny. Let me share my screen here. I hope you see my screen. So I will be presenting to you very high level the results of this landmark trial that you've heard mentioned several times today, Study 31, A5349, which was conducted by the CDC TB Trials Consortium in partnership with the NIH AIDS Clinical Trials Group. The key question of Study 30 was to optimally rifapentine with or without moxifloxacin in conjunction with companion drugs allow treatment shortening to 4 months for drug susceptibility. And I'm showing you the study schema here. There were 3 arms. The standard control arm is the CDC WHO endorsed 6-month regimen. And then 2 experimental regimens were both rifapentine based with one given for 17 months, with one of the 2 further enhanced by adding moxifloxacin in place of ethambutol. Randomization was 1:1:1. It was a non-inferiority design. It was open label, and primary efficacy endpoint was measured at 12 months. One of the reasons why I think this is a landmark study is that the eligibility criteria really tried to push the envelope for when the trial was being developed by enrolling adolescents and then for HIV, those living with HIV, including those with CD4 counts as low as 100. Rifapentine was given at flat dose grams for all based on pharmacokinetic work that in part RADA led for the consortium in partnership with others at Hopkins and other members of the TBTC consortium. Moxifloxacin was 400. So the study was conducted across 13 countries. This is another reason why a landmark trial. It has broad geographic representation for 34 clinical research sites. Again, the partnership between TBTC and ACTG is part of the underpinning of the success of this trial. So over 5,000 patients with tuberculosis suspected were screened for the trial. 2,500, just over, were randomized and to the 3 arms. And I'm showing you the consort diagram, which then breaks down for you the intention to treat populations, the microbiologically eligible populations, and the accessible groups, with the exclusions that are shown here. Basically, to be biologically eligible and being excluded from the ITT, you would have had to have had, for example, baseline drug resistance identified, or the cultures weren't in fact positive after all. The 2 co-primary populations for analysis were the microbiologically eligible group and the accessible group. So even though there's some exclusions noted here, that the primary endpoints were looked at in both populations for consistency. This is one shot of the sort of breakdown of characteristics for the trial participants. 70% of participants were male. This is consistent with contemporary TB clinical trials. Age was around 31, median age. There's a diversity of races, as shown here. About 8% of the population were people living with HIV, which corresponds to the global epidemiologic numbers for TB HIV worldwide. And 72% of the enrolled population had cavitation on chest X-ray at baseline. and which in conjunction with a BMI of about 18 illustrates that this was a population that had severe disease. I'm going to run right into the top line results, and I want to celebrate right here at this point that one of the two experimental regimens, specifically the rifapentine moxifloxacin containing regimen, met non-inferiority criteria for efficacy across both analysis populations, accessible and microbiologically eligible, that I've shown you here, and that this upper bound of the 95 confidence interval shown here was well below the margin of non-inferiority, which was 6.6%, shown with this red arrow. Unfortunately, optimizing the dose of rifapentine alone without moxifloxacin did not meet non-inferiority criteria for efficacy across the populations, and that's shown here. Another reason why this is landmark is that, frankly, the primary efficacy results are reproducible and consistent throughout all sensitivity analyses. We're showing you here 14 sensitivity analyses of a whole variety of different ways of looking at it, all of which were pre-specified, all of which reaffirm the non-inferiority of the rifapentine regimen. And that's something, again, in contemporary TB trials, is for me a landmark event. And another reason why it's a landmark trial with an impressive achievement with this 4-month regimen is shown in this table, courtesy of Patrick Phillips, that essentially shows you the difference between, or that compares the 4-month regimens in study 31 to other 4-month regimens studied over the past 10 to 15 years. What you're seeing here is that the rifapentine moxifloxacin arm shown here is the most potent regimen we have studied to date at 4 months. And even though the rifapentine substitute did not meet non-inferiority, it's actually still the second most potent regimen ever studied to date. And the comparators here using the accessible analysis population are here from Oflatub, Remox, Stand, and Rifaquin, which have all presented results in New England Journal and elsewhere. And this is amazing. A much more direct way to put this is eloquently put together by Dick Chason at Johns Hopkins University, that shows that we've been stuck at 6 months for way too long, and reminds us that since the 1950s, when Elvis was king, we were at 24 months of treatment, and we've gradually shrunk. In the 60s with the Beatles, in the 70s, we've been at 8 months, and then, in that era, got to 6 months, and we've been stuck there until 2020. And he illustrates some of the great events in our culture. And Huey Lewis is highlighted as the 1970 benchmark. And so it's been since then that we've not been able to reduce this to 4 months, another landmark event. I only have safety. I want to show you here that in blue, there's arm, red is the rifapentine only arm, and the green is rifapentine moxifloxacin. And this just shows you that the grade 3 to 5 adverse events, tolerability, serious adverse events, death were all similar across all groups. The rifapentine only arm may be slightly better tolerated, have fewer grade 3 to 5 and slightly better tolerated, but all in all, this is very similar finding in safety and tolerability, which is very reassuring given the higher doses of rifamycins. So in summary, the 4-month 2-HPZM, 2-HPM trial regimen in study 31 met non-inferiority for efficacy consistently across all analyses. We were pleased to see that high-dose rifapentine regimens were safe and well tolerated. And the achievement of having a first successful treatment shortening in drug susceptible TB in 40 years is truly a landmark event. This study was funded by the CDC TB Trials Consortium, the NIH, NIAID, ACT, and I want to thank all those who have played an instrumental role in bringing this success forward. I thank you. I'll hand it over to Dr. Holland to share his personal stories with us. Thank you, Dr. Holland.
Thank you. So I remember my first patient of internal medicine rotation in medical school was a young man who had pulmonary TB disease and empyema. And from that time, I have been a part of teams, both in training and in practice, treating patients with tuberculosis infection and tuberculosis disease. And in counseling those patients, I knew that I was asking them about or stressing the importance of drug adherence, the necessity of lab work and contact tracing and the follow-up imaging studies. But it wasn't till I got sick in 2014 that I realized all the things that I never told my patients or didn't know to tell my patients who were living with TB disease that I now know as a survivor. And my hope is that some of what I teach you today will be to carry forth the lessons that I learned as a patient so that you may share these with your patients that you see and your work that you do without having to get the disease yourself. Next slide, please. So I don't want to spend too much time on the medical details of the case. You all, or many of you, are in practice treating a lot of tuberculosis. I'll just quickly say that I had a positive skin test as part of our med school screening in 2004. I actually completed my 9 months of isoniazid, but then 10 years and many potential exposures later, I woke up in the night with some severe chest pain and shaking chills, was seen in the emergency department, treated for community-acquired pneumonia with levofloxacin, felt better for about 3 months, until I woke up in the morning with hemoptysis, coughing up blood clots. Next slide, please. And these are my X-ray and my CAT scan, some nice cavities living there, and some positive rhodamine, auramine stains for the mycobacteria. And so I'm so glad to be going after Payam's discussion of study 31 with our next slide, please. So this handful of 16 pills was my breakfast, my directly observed breakfast for the first 2 months of my treatment. There are too many of them, they're too old, and it was for too long. I remember at about 6 weeks of treatment, holding this in my hand, looking down at it, and feeling tired, nauseated, weak, depressed, and staring at the meds and wondering, is it the meds? Is it the disease? And just knowing that I had many more months to go on this, it was very disheartening. And although the 2 months may not seem like a lot or if you're asking yourself, geez, that's only 2 months. Think about it as at the time when I was in treatment, my son was 2 years old, and the amount of his life that 2 months would have given me without these wonderful poisons, it makes a tremendous difference. And this is what the TB survivor community is looking for. Less time with drugs. And as our other presenters, we're putting forth what's in the pipeline of better drugs, of fewer side effects, because there hasn't been a change for 40 years, not because these meds are awesome. It's because we hadn't done the investment as we started off the conference talking about. And so I'm really feeling optimistic that these 2 months can mean a lifetime to somebody who is actually taking them. And I'm grateful that this slide is outdated, and hope that in a few years, all of my slides will be outdated because of the advances by all of you. Next slide, please. So this is my son. He is mortified. He's 8 years old now, mortified that I'm showing this to you all today. But he was on rifampin for window prophylaxis. And tuberculosis, like most significant illnesses, we never give a diagnosis to an individual. It's always to a family. But I think tuberculosis, more than many illnesses, truly is an infection of the family. Not just for whether it's latent infection or window prophylaxis or latent infection treatments, but also isolation, follow-up testing. The way that I sat across from many patients, but I never took the time to turn to the spouse or the parents or the children to say, your loved one is going to be out of commission. This illness is all consuming. I was not able to provide the childcare and the support that I wanted to during my illness. I was not able to be the presence I wanted to be for my patients at work. And my loving wife, she had to be a single parent in many ways. And my colleagues had this. My son didn't have the presence that I wanted to be because of what this illness does and how it really does go for the whole family. So please, as you're looking forward, do go and look at the spouses and the other family members and say, we know that this illness is really, this diagnosis is for all of you. Next slide, please. So the only person who thought that my mask was cool was my son. He thought that me walking around in a mask was the coolest thing that he could possibly imagine. But TB is a tremendously stigmatized disease. And we all know that if a disease is stigmatized, our patients don't seek help. And it makes a bad situation worse for our patients. Now, as you all know in your work, my face is not the typical face of a tuberculosis patient. I don't think of a US-born white boy from Massachusetts as the typical patient. And in some ways, I'm always glad to be an advocate for TB patients because it's very important people understand that airborne diseases are for everyone. And an airborne disease anywhere is an important priority for every single person who breathes air. But as I was wearing the mask, which I think some of the mask stigma is certainly less now in the era of COVID, but as I was wearing the mask, I felt people get off the elevator, people go to the other side of the playground, cross the street. And again, as a person, as a cisgendered, English-speaking US-born male, white male, I never experienced stigma before. And this gave me a tiny glimpse of what that stigma might feel like and what that does to an already suffering body. And I had to try to imagine what most of my patients with TB disease are feeling as a non-English speaker, non-US born, a person of color, and how that makes everything so much more challenging than it needs to be. So all the work that we do in using destigmatizing language, and it matters. It really does, because believe me, that tuberculosis disease is hard enough. Next slide, please. This is my hospital bill as a reminder of the economic impact of tuberculosis. And many of my colleagues on this call, you know both globally and how TB disease in general affects the economics of a country and individuals. But I wanted to also bring it down to the individual level, that I am a person who had full health insurance, so I didn't pay this bill. This was an insurance company bill. And even in our public health departments, we're so grateful they are TB drug assistance programs that make the drugs free and available to us. The economic cost of tuberculosis disease goes beyond the hospital bills, the x-ray, the labs, and the pills. Although for those of us, our community members who don't have coverage, that's a huge barrier, a tremendous barrier that we need to forever advocate to take away. But it is also, I was not able to safely return to work for 5 weeks because of the isolation and the cavities and the amount of bacilli that I still had in my sputum. I had a job that fully understood what my disease meant and what it was, short-term disability insurance, and full health coverage. So many of our patients do not have that. That 5 weeks without the paycheck is the difference between eviction or hunger. And so all of these social factors are tremendously important in our treatment planning. And I would argue that we should be equally thinking about rent protection in a bag of groceries on the same plane as the next set of transaminases as part of our follow-up treatment. Because even if we as clinicians are not thinking about that rent payment, certainly the patients are, and as well as a forever advocacy for universal health coverage for everybody, because the economic impact of this disease, even in the best of circumstances, can be felt. And for most of our patients, certainly did not have the privilege that I brought in my own situation. Next slide, please. So I had full knowledge of what was going on in my body because of my medical background. I had a supportive spouse, Emily, with me every step of the way, other family members, colleagues, and yet I have still never felt so alone. And it wasn't just the 11 days in a negative pressure room by myself, although that was certainly part of it. But this illness is tremendously isolating. And for all the survivors that I've worked with, MDR, drug sensitive in the US, elsewhere, that feeling of just isolation in the deeper sense of the word, not just, again, confined to the home, but the real isolation is very present, and it's traumatic. And so go to the next part of the slide. That's part of what your patients need to know. They're not alone. They're not isolated. That there are people out there, many millions, who have gone through this. And so this happens to be the survivor organization that I work very closely with and am proud to be a part of. But in your communities, wherever you are, whether it's with the language, anything you can do to link up your patients with other survivors is going to be hugely important, because our patients don't need to feel isolated. They are not alone, but I promise you, even if they don't say they feel it, that they feel it. And that is something very concrete. If you take nothing else away, know that your patients are not alone, and that I and my friends, we do a Monday night, every Monday, a Zoom just to talk about how bad the meds are or what it feels like, anything. Just, we call it support space for We Are TB. And so please get your patients connected with some type of a survivor group, because they're not alone. Next slide, please. And I just want to acknowledge these are the folks who kept me alive, both mentally and physically during all of this. And so I'll leave it at that, and am very privileged to pass along the next presentation to Dr. Janice Louie.
Thank you. All right, I think I can be heard, I hope. Let me know. I am honored to be invited to give our local perspective on our TB trends during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. I have no conflicts of interest. Next slide. So first, here is a bird's eye view of TB in San Francisco relative to the rest of the country. So in the United States in 2019, our incidence was 2.7 per 100,000 population. California is a hotspot at 5.3 per 100,000. And San Francisco is super hot at 11.9 per 100,000. Next slide. Here is who gets TB in San Francisco. We are an older patient population. Our median age is 64 years. And last year we treated a patient who was 101 years old. The majority are non-US born, 75% from Asia, and our most common countries are China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Over 80% of our patients have been in the US over 5 years, so this is likely reactivation disease. And our case rate in Asians is 17.3 times that in non-Hispanic white populations. Next slide. So with regard to COVID, the effects of COVID-19 were felt in San Francisco weeks before the actual cases were identified. And that's because our San Francisco International Airport receives approximately 23,000 passengers annually from Wuhan. And so on January 17th, San Francisco International began to screen for COVID-19 symptoms in persons arriving from Wuhan, China. And that was expanded on February 2nd to all incoming travelers from mainland China. And so all those passengers were required to undergo a mandatory 14-day quarantine in home. And as a result, travelers incoming from most of Asia actually dropped precipitously. Next slide. Our local leaders were very proactive. On March 1st, the first 2 cases of COVID-19 were confirmed. They had no epi-link, signaling community transmission was here. And within the next 2 weeks, there were multiple progressively restrictive health officer orders, including prohibition of non-essential large gatherings, shelter in place, and ordering our residents to defer routine medical appointments and elective surgeries. Next slide. And so as a result, in our TB clinic, in our program, we saw a huge drop in our number of cases and our activity. So in this figure, the white bars are total cases on treatment. So that's our census. The gray bars are new active TB cases diagnosed. And the black bars are B waiver notifications. So B waivers are incoming immigrants with concerns for active TB on X-ray who are required to report to us upon arrival in San Francisco. And you'll see that compared to the 2 years prior, from February to May, we had a huge drop in our activity. In fact, by the end of May 2020, we were at 40% of pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. And so you've now heard that this was happening worldwide. At first, different countries reported decreased TB notifications ranging as high up as 80%. And this was later confirmed by large global surveillance networks. Next slide. And there have many reasons vary as to why this was happening. There are lots of hypotheses out there. I think it varies quite a bit from area to area. So for many, the shifting of TB clinical staff and laboratory resources to support COVID-19 surveillance was a big one. It wasn't so much for us. For us, we think it was more about shelter in place. So we think there may have been many symptomatic persons out there who had fear of going into a healthcare facility because of COVID, or could not go in because they lost their job-related health insurance or lost income to pay for healthcare. Additionally, there were frontline physicians who were focusing on screening for COVID-19, and they may have overlooked evaluating for TB. And finally, it's likely that many of our Asian population were staying home due to fear of stigma, harassment, and circulating social media stories about hate crimes, which have actually, despite recent national news, have been ongoing in San Francisco since February of 2020. Next slide. So we decided to do another look 11 months in, and we divided our review into 2 periods based on shelter in place, which is kind of a proxy for all the restrictive measures that were put into place in San Francisco. Our shelter in place order again was on March 16, 2020. And as a reminder, TB in San Francisco was reportable to us, our program, within 1 working day of diagnosis. And all fatalities, we use a standardized algorithm to review medical records, to review death certificates. We consider extent of disease, time on treatment, and culture conversion status before we decide whether cause of death is TB related. Next slide. So this figure is worth taking a little bit of a look at. So here's what we found. SIP was implemented on March 16th, 2020. We looked at the 14.5 months pre-SIP from January 2019 through March 15th, 2020, and then 10.5 months after SIP was implemented through January 31st, 2021. The line on top reflects monthly total TB cases on treatment in San Francisco. The gray bars are new TB diagnosis each month, and the black bars are new cases who presented with symptoms severe enough to be hospitalized, and the striped bars are TB-related deaths. We found that pre-SIP, most newly diagnosed TB cases presented as outpatients, with roughly 10 to 50% presenting with symptoms severe enough to be hospitalized, and you'll see that there was some sporadic TB-related deaths. There was a lull between, let's say, April to June 2020, And then in the latter half of 22, our cases started climbing again. But what I want to point out to you is that a larger proportion were hospitalized, as reflected by the black relative to the gray bars. And we, although the numbers are small, appear to be having more TB-related deaths. Next slide. So this table is a different way to look at it. So we have pre-SIP, where we had a total of 114 new diagnoses of active TB for an average of 7.9 per month. And during SIP, we had a total of 52 new cases of TB for an average of 5 per month. The median age of our cases did not change pre-SIP or during SIP. However, we do notice that there is a proportion during SIP who are more likely to be hospitalized. The numbers are small, but to require intensive care and to have a TB-related death. Next slide. So we tried to look at some other factors that might be involved with shelter in place, but we found no difference in the proportion who were non-US born from the different countries of origin. There was no difference in those who used alcohol or substance use or had a mental health or psychiatric diagnosis. There was no difference in presence of cavity or duration of symptoms, although the caveat is that there is some literature out there that in older persons, they are less likely to present with cavitary TB disease, and they may have more nonspecific symptoms. We did find a difference in proportion during SIP who were homeless or had marginal housing. Next slide. And this makes sense because San Francisco saw a dramatic increase in numbers of homeless as shelters closed down or severely restricted their capacity, and in the context of a historic economic downturn. There was also reduction in supportive services such as temporary housing, alcohol rehab and addiction medicine services, and social worker and case manager support. So there was very little access to a lot of pre-pandemic services for our marginalized population. Next slide. So I'm not sure how surprised we all are, but there have been historical references to increases in teen mortality following other large epidemics, including the 1918 flu pandemic, SARS in Hong Kong, Ebola in West Africa, and MERS in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, as you all know, the Stop TB Partnership conducted a modeling study which predicted that prolonged disruption in TB services could result in an additional over 6 million TB cases and over 1 million TB-related deaths over the next 5 years. So in a way, San Francisco in our microcosm may be a real-world example of the predictions made by Stop TB. Next slide. So what are we doing next? We have intensified case finding and outreach to our frontline healthcare providers, and with the help of the state health department, we have put out flyers reminding our providers to look out for TB in populations at risk and in those persons who have respiratory symptoms and an X-ray that is abnormal. We have many of our nurses and clinicians going out into the home to provide care for those patients who are sheltering in place. We've scaled up contact tracing. We have a goal of expanding our video and telehealth capacities, although frankly, our populations are either uncomfortable or have limited access to technology. But I think at a greater level, what's important for us is that we want to promote at our local level how our TB skill set can support COVID or other future communicable disease outbreaks. We feel that we are experts in contact tracing, ventilation, respiratory protection, specimen collection that is done safely, PCR result interpretation, and we have established networks to perform outreach to vulnerable populations. So in San Francisco, we feel that we are small but mighty, and this has been our opportunity to highlight what we can offer, and we hope to contribute more to the overall efforts. So last slide, I want to thank everyone, our teams and our staffing. It could all not have been done without you in a coherent and teamwork effort. So I am now going to pass it on to Dr. Aditya Kadamanchi.
Great, thanks Janice, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to present this new and exciting program that's funded through the National Institutes of Health. Next slide. I was struck when this tweet came across my my Twitter feed. It was from Nature Biotechnology saying the failure of the clinical diagnostic sector to deal with the demands of a 21st century pandemic is a wake-up call. And the first thing that popped into my head is I wonder what they would think about what's been going on with tuberculosis for millennia, really, as other speakers have highlighted. So this program from the NIH is really meant to answer this call, right? How can we advance, make the similar advances in TB diagnostics that we've just made in just under a year for COVID? Next slide. So what we're funded to do is to really sort of actively sort of scout new and promising technologies for TB diagnosis. We're primarily focusing on 4 use cases. These are rapid tests, molecular tests for diagnosing TB or for screening for TB using non-sputum sort of biomarker-based tests. And then finally, sort of rapid drug resistance assays that can be done to enable people to rapidly initiate on the appropriate treatment. What we're doing for this really is we're partnering with the UCSF Rosenman Institute, which is a local life science accelerator, which has networks and relationships with, within Silicon Valley and beyond, really sort of trying to get beyond sort of the traditional sort of players involved in TB diagnostics. We're also actively working with folks in academia, getting inquiries through our website, as well as conducting region-specific active scouting in countries like South Korea, Japan, India, Brazil, other sort of countries where TB is common. There's also sort of burgeoning sort of life science industries. Next slide. What we offer to these product developers is really, complete expertise in conducting sort of phased evaluation of novel tests, whether they're early prototypes, late prototypes, or actual sort of final sort of design lock products. And our goals are to do this in a flexible, transparent, fair, efficient way that results in sort of high amount of generalizability of our results. So we provide sort of standardized end user assessments and empiric costing studies and transmission modeling, in addition to sort of standard sort of diagnostic accuracy studies. Next slide. We're fortunate to partner with clinical trial sites across the globe. So we have partners in 10 different countries, and these are really sort of expert clinical trial networks that can rapidly sort of initiate studies of novel diagnostics and reduce the barrier for companies that are wanting to engage in this space or able to engage in this space, but don't have the field infrastructure to actually either obtain specimens or obtain field data and feedback to move their technologies forward. Next slide. Currently, we're funding studies in 5 countries, predominantly South Africa, Uganda, India, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And we'll shift these around to sort of target the populations that are needed, depending on the products that we identify over the next sort of 5 years. Next slide. I'll just end by acknowledging the many folks involved, both at UCSF and our partners, both at other institutions in the US and Europe, and also in sort of many of the high burden countries where our clinical studies are taking place. Please reach out to us if you have any questions about the program, or if you're a product developer and have any exciting new sort of diagnostic or technology that could be applied for TB diagnosis. And next, I'll move on. I'll sort of pass the mic along to my colleague, Elizabeth Fair, to talk about the TB Rat program.
Great. Thank you, Aditya. And thank you to the audience for staying with us until this final presentation. I have just a few slides about a new program based in the UCSF Center for Tuberculosis called the TB Research and Mentorship Program, TB RAMP for short. We are considering today our official launch of this program and are excited to share this with you on World TB Day. This is also co-led with by Dr. Payam Nahi. Next slide, please. So you can see here on the left is a screenshot of a program flyer with a little more information about the TB RAMP program. This is included in the materials, so you should all have access to this on the webinar website. In terms of the TB Research and Mentorship Program goals, they really cut across academia. So first and foremost, our focus is on trainees. It's on attracting and preparing early stage investigators for successful careers in tuberculosis. We're focusing in this program on postdoctoral fellows, clinical fellows, and assistant professor level junior faculty members. We really want to strengthen the pipeline of dedicated researchers to conducting TB research here at UCSF and in the Bay Area. A second priority is strengthening the relationships between faculty and staff. As you've heard, we have fantastic research going on already in the Bay Area at UCSF, and we really want to promote collaborations between faculty and staff working on TB, both across disciplines, across departments, across different areas. And finally, in terms of strengthening institutions, we are partnering with UC Berkeley on this. So we're looking forward to including UC Berkeley TB RAM scholars as well as those at UCSF. Next slide, please. So what is the TB RAMP program? This summarizes the key components in one slide. The first focus is on providing TB scientific training around TB. So we really are hoping to support the TB RAMP scholars in building the skills, the methods expertise, and the content expertise to address TB scientific knowledge gaps. We'll do this by hosting TB-specific research seminars, workshops, fireside chats with faculty members who are working in the area, as well as call upon the existing methods courses that are so rich at UCSF already. The second goal really is to offer research opportunities and experiences for our TB RAMP scholars. In addition to creating opportunities and linkages with the existing research here at UCSF, we are also very excited to offer research funding opportunities. We all know that this is a major challenge in achieving independence as a researcher. So we offered the first ever Mentored Scientist Award in TB via the UCSF RAP program. We plan on offering this twice a year throughout the duration of this program, and are thrilled to see what kind of proposals we see to really ignite TB research in these early stage investigators. And finally, at the heart of the program is mentoring. It's linking with both career mentors for the TB RAMP scholars as well as research mentors, and engaging in a team mentoring approach. We also will build networking opportunities and professional developed workshops for our TB RAMP scholars. One example of this is hopefully next year on World TB Day, we will all be together in person in an auditorium, and have already planned to have a specific sessions for TB RAMP scholars to present the work they've done in their first year in the program. So fingers crossed we can make that happen next year. Next slide, please. So final slide, these are just some resources. We have a website that you can go to for more information. Please review that, look at eligibility criteria and a little more information about the program. We are accepting TB RAMP scholar applications until April 5th. So please consider applying, reach out to us at this email with any questions you might have. But we're thrilled to offer this and hope that it really ignites more connections, both investment in early stage investigators and connections across UCSF and UC Berkeley in igniting TB research. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks. Thanks to everyone who in this last session on clinical and programmatic issues. We've really had such a wonderful session today. We have used up most of our QA time, but I would like to just take a second here to acknowledge maybe just one quick question, because I think it's really relevant. And Payam, I'm going to slip this question to you from John Smolsky, who says, what timeline do you envision for the rollout of the rifapentine 4-month regimen? And what's the access like to rifapentine outside of the US? And then we could close. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Lisa, thanks, John. I'm pleased to tell you that the World Health Organization is convening a guideline development group meeting to review the Study 31 results. This is scheduled for April 27th through April 30th. And we will hope to see the recommendations coming from the World Health Organization for that regimen. Insofar as rifapentine access has been increasing across the world through the Global Drug Facility. It is the backbone of obviously the 3HP regimen, the 3-month regimen for LTBI. So we anticipate rifapentine availability to continue. I think those are the sort of the high-level responses about access to that regimen. So fingers crossed. There's still a lot of work to do. I'm sure everyone on this is aware of the nitrosamine issues with rifamycins in general, along with metformin and a few other very important drugs to health. And that's a developing issue that many are focusing their energies towards addressing. So we hope to see light at the end of this tunnel as well.
Well, Payam, I think I speak for the whole crowd to thank you and Dick Chasen and all of the folks involved in Study 31. I think it was phenomenal. You've given us great hope, and now we've got to put it into practice. So in closing, last thing you'd like to say?
I hope all those who've attended are inspired by the presentations, by the personal stories from Congresswoman Dolores' comments around her father living in a sanatoria and how it impacted her childhood, and through to Dr. Holland's story, journey that for me was incredibly painful to hear. We can do better. We have to do better for our patients. Their challenges are great, but I hope you've also heard through the advocacy and the comments of our congressional leaders, the opportunity is great. And we are at a point in biomedical research with TB, as described by Joel, by Babak, Radha, others, where there's real advances on the horizon. And I would just end by calling to action all of you to continue to do your fight, raise awareness, and dare mighty things. As Roosevelt said, dare mighty things. And, we hope to see you all next year at the World. I wanted to thank everyone who's been working on the organization of this World TB Day event. A special shout out to Kelly Musoki, Alicia Couchman, Amelia Alonso, Lisa, of course, you, so many others. I can't name them all, but it was a really good event. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Now, there will be a recording posted on the website if you'd like to share that with your friends. And please do give us your feedback. We'll be sending out an evaluation. Really, thank you all for just the wonderful work you're doing and sharing this part of your World TB Day with us. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.